Rabbi Nachman speaks a lot about the importance of stories. In Yiddishkeit, we find that in the Torah, the entire first book, Bereshis, and 50% of the second book is all stories. I'd like to start telling over one of the outstanding stories that took place in the past 50 years that play a very important role in Breslov, specifically regarding the pilgrimages to Uman, to the gravesite of Rabbi Nachman. This story takes place in 1979, 32 years ago, Tovshin Lametes, and I believe that there are going to be some very, very important lessons that we can learn from every aspect of this story. It began with the fact that at that time, one of the elders of Breslov, Reb Michal Dorfman Zechron Avracha, had emigrated to Eretz Yisrael earlier, was living in Yerushalayim, and he was one of the last Breslov elders to leave Ukraine, to leave Russia for Eretz Yisrael. Most of his friends had left 30, 40 years earlier. Unfortunately, he ended up going through 6.5 years in Siberia, which he called the Little Siberia, and the rest of the time in the Big Siberia. He referred to the entire Russia as the Big Siberia. It was all one large prison, and finally got to Eretz Yisrael and came to Yerushalayim and served as the mashgiach in the Breslov Kollel in Yerushalayim. And at the same time, he was one of the last people to maintain a serious connection with the family that lived in the house that bordered the gravesite of Rabbi Nachman in Uman. This is a non-Jewish family. The name was Zabeda, and Rabbi Nachman's kever at that time was in their backyard. There was no matzeva, there was no visible sign that it was the gravesite of a tzaddik. It was simply a slab of concrete on the ground in the backyard of this small ranch-style home. The Russian government, at that time it was still during communism, and the Russian government would set its policies in 5-year plans. In the Kremlin, the capital of the USSR, the Russian leaders would sit and plan out for the next 5 years all kinds of changes, improvements, things that were to take place in the Soviet bloc. And then they would pass on these instructions to the different governments, local governments, the different countries that were part of it. The woman, Mrs. Zabeda, who lived in the house at that time, sent word back to Eretz Yisrael, to Rabbi Michal Dorfman Zechron Avracha, through one of the people that had visited Uman. In those days, Russia and Israel, Eretz Yisrael, did not have any diplomatic relations, so that a person with an Israeli passport could not enter Russia, the Soviet Union at all. However, there were people from the United States and other places that were given permission sometimes, with all kinds of difficulties, to be able to visit Uman, to be able to visit the gravesite of Rabbi Nachman. And one of these people who had been there was given a message by this woman to deliver, to take to Israel, to Rabbi Michal Dorfman, whom she still remembered, and to tell him about this crisis that was taking place. The crisis being that she had been informed, together with the other local residents that lived in the areas surrounding the kever of Rabbi Nachman, the gravesite of Rabbi Nachman, that their homes were going to be taken down and they were going to be replaced by a complex of apartment buildings, 9-story buildings. Each building would have 30, 40 apartments in it. And the people that owned these ranch-style houses there would all be relocated into these apartment buildings. She was concerned that she would lose her garden with her chickens, with her flowers, but she knew that Reb Michal Zechron Avracha, together with the other leaders of Breslov, would be very concerned if they knew that the kever of Rabbi Nachman was in jeopardy. A little bit of background: Rabbi Nachman, when he was 30 years old, lived in the city of Breslov, and he actually said that his students, his followers, would be known as Breslever chassidim, because of the fact that he lived in that city for 8 years, from the age of 29 to 37, approximately, and that's where the majority of his Torah was taught to his students. However, when he was traveling, he passed through this city of Uman, and he came to the site of the mass grave in which were contained the remains of 30,000 Jewish martyrs who had given up their lives willingly. They were tested at the time. They were offered a choice to live if they were to bow to a cross and give up their religion in a sense, or to be hacked to death by the Haidamaks. The Haidamaks, the Kazakhs, Gonto, who were roaming through the Ukraine at that time, Poland, those areas, and trying to look for any excuse they could to murder Jews, to massacre Jews. In this city of Uman, because of the fact that it was a walled city, it was pretty much well protected, and the leader, the feudal lord that was in charge of the city, Pataki, liked the Jews, so people from the surrounding areas, when they heard that the Haidamaks were approaching the area, they fled to Uman, hoping that they would be safe there. It's a long story how the Haidamaks fooled this Pataki to open the gates of the city. They came in, they murdered his only daughter. He had a daughter, Sophia. They murdered her as they had promised they would if he refused to let them in, and they broke in. And even though he ended up allowing them to enter, they still went ahead and murdered his daughter. And there was a park, an extraordinary park, that was put together in Uman later, called the Sofievka Park, in memory of the daughter of this great leader. And these Haidamaks, Kazakhs, ended up hacking to death Jewish men, women, and children who all refused to bow to the cross over a period of 3 days. There were Jews who hid out in the forests, who weren't caught, in caves, who heard the screams and the cries of these people dying in this way. A person hacked doesn't die in a minute necessarily. Sometimes it could take 15 minutes, sometimes it could take an hour. And the excruciating pain, the screams that took place at that time. And after they were chased out by the Russian or Polish army at the time that came in, the Jews who were in hiding came out and dug 2 huge ditches, a kever achim as it's called, in which they buried the remains, as much as they could gather up, of these 30,000 Jews. Rabbi Nachman, when he was traveling through Uman, came to this site, stood there, and the students that were with him said his face turned red, like something very big was going on, and he said to his students, this would be a very good place to remain. And then he left. He continued on his trip. He went back home to Breslov, lived there for another 7 years, and after a whole series of events, ended up moving. His house was destroyed through fire on a Friday night, together with many other homes in Breslov, and sure enough, the following week, he was on his way to Uman, where he lived the last 6 months of his life, and passed away at the age of 38, and was buried in the site that he had chosen 8 years earlier. When he was in Uman and said this would be a good place to remain, he was buried in that old cemetery among these 30,000 Kedoshim, these martyrs. However, as a result of World War II and other events that took place, in Ukraine the soil is very, very soft, and even though that cemetery was used afterwards to bury people, very often the matzevas would sink, the stones would sink into the ground because of the nature of the climate and the earth there. Towards the end of World War II, there was a meeting of a Russian general and a German general that took place in Uman. When they parted ways, the German general threw a grenade at the site where Rabbi Nachman was buried. There was a small building that was erected over that site, an oihel as it's called, which was there from the time that Rabbi Nachman was buried in the early 1800s till World War II, and this was destroyed by that grenade. After World War II, the Russians allowed people to buy land in that area to build homes over what used to be a cemetery. A whole story how one of the Jews gave money to someone else to purchase a plot of land and to put up a house there in such a way that the gravesite of Rabbi Nachman would be right alongside the wall. so that nobody else would build over that. You don't build another house. These are detached homes. Nobody would build another house right on top of it, and in this way to preserve the site. And sure enough, this is what took place. That house ended up being transferred at one point to a non-Jew, then to another non-Jew. This family, Zabeda, who lived there until the early 1980s. Actually, later than that. Until about 15 years ago. Now, the Russians had decided that they're going to put up an apartment building complex there, which meant that they were going to dig up the entire area. Graves, not graves, didn't mean anything to them. At this point in time already, there were no visible graves there. There was no sign, no zecher that this was once a cemetery of any sort. And the only site that had been preserved was this slab of cement under which Rabbi Nachman was buried. So this woman sent word to Reb Michal, knowing that if there was anyone who would take this seriously and would try to do something to help the situation, it would be him. Because he was, in a sense, the last Breslov elder to continue maintaining the Rosh Hashanah gathering in Uman during communist years, when it meant literally risking one's life to gather in that city. Every year they would gather in a different house there, and to conduct these services, the Rosh Hashanah Tfilos, the Shofar, and to be able to visit the kever on Erev Rosh Hashanah, as is the custom among Jews. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Law, tells us that one of the customs of the Jewish people is on Erev Rosh Hashanah to visit Kivrei Tzaddikim, the graves of Tzaddikim, or the graves of our parents, grandparents, in order to ask Hashem to help us in the merit of these Tzaddikim to be blessed with a good year. Or also to include the hope that these tzaddikim will join us in our prayers on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, Aseret Yimei Tshuva, for us to be blessed with a good year. So Reb Michal was the last one to conduct these gatherings under communist rule before he was eventually allowed to leave Russia in the early 1960s. When he heard about this, he immediately realized the gravity of what was taking place here. The fact that in the Kremlin, which is in Moscow, hundreds of miles away from Kiev, from Ukraine, somebody sitting there came up with a bright idea that in this little town called Uman, a town which at that time maybe had 50,000, 60,000 residents, and in the part of the town, not in the center of the city, where there's a little bit of commerce, a little bit of business, but on the outskirts of the city, where Rabbi Nachman is buried, would have been one of the last places to think of putting up apartment buildings. That's the site that they happened to choose, and he felt that this was definitely something going on in heaven, a plan, a plot by the Satan to try to eliminate, to try to take away this important site from Klal Yisrael. We know that the Sforim tell us that when it came to the Jews going out of Mitzrayim, out of the exile of Egypt, Moshe Rabbeinu understood that one of the critical pieces in order to be able to make that happen was the coffin of Yosef HaTzadik, Aroinoi Shel Yosef. And while the rest of Klal Yisrael was busy fulfilling Hashem's wish of gathering up all the gold and silver of Egypt to be able to take out with them, in order to fulfill Hashem's promise to Avram Avinu that the Jews would be enslaved for many years, but that when they would leave with great wealth, the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was involved in a special mission to search for and find the coffin of Yosef HaTzadik, to make sure to be able to take that with him in leaving Egypt, in crossing the Red Sea, and in traveling to Eretz Yisrael. He knew that this was the battering ram, this was the insurance, this was what would guarantee that Klal Yisrael would succeed in leaving Egypt, in making it across the Red Sea, and in making it into Eretz Yisrael. In fact, we find the Torah tells us, Hayom Ro'o Vayonos, that the Red Sea, the Yam Suf, saw, what did it see? Vayonos. It saw the great Jew about whom it's written, he ran. He ran from Potiphar's wife. He ran to avoid a major sin. The sea saw the coffin of Yosef HaTzadik, and it split in both terms. And other Ramazim that we have that show that the Aroinoi Shel Yosef, the coffin of Yosef HaTzadik, played a major role in the Geula of Mitzrayim. And so too the Sforim tell us that the Geula, the redemption that we are waiting for today, after thousands of years of exile, second exile, the first exile, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Jews were in Golus for 70 years. After the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the second Beis Hamikdash was built. From the time that that's been destroyed, it's been over 2,000 years that we're still in exile. And the Sforim tell us that the Geula, the redemption that we're waiting for now, is also going to require, one of the major pieces to it is going to be Kivrei Tzaddikim, the kever of the tzaddik. And we see this as something in recent years that's picking up speed in an incredible way, where these sites, which were not treated that significantly 50 years ago, 100 years ago, Miron, the kever of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai Zal, Hebron, the Moras HaMachpelah, Kever Rachel, even those places, we see on a day-to-day basis, more and more Jews, local and from all over the world, are coming to visit these sites, to the point where on the yard site of Rachel Imenu, which took place 2 days ago, Yud Aleph Cheshvan, there were tens of thousands of Jews who visited Kever Rachel. On the yard site of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai Zal on Lag BaOmer, we find that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews that gather in Miron to make a kesher with the kever of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, not just on the yard site, that's when you have those kind of numbers, but throughout the year. There isn't a Shabbos in recent years that there aren't groups of hundreds of people from different parts of Eretz Yisrael, from Chutz La'aretz, going there to spend Shabbos in that area, to make a kesher. Hebron, the Moras HaMachpelah, Kever Rachel. And so too, this kever of Rabbi Nachman, which to the Breslever chassidim is considered one of the most important sites in the world, one of our important connections to the tzaddik, to know that now the Russians were planning on tearing up the whole area around that. In order to put up a building of 9 stories, you have to dig pretty deep foundations. It involves digging up the entire area. It was clear that this was a plan to chas v'sholom obliterate that site. Reb Michal immediately spoke to the other elders of Breslov at that time, who were based generally in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim. They met to discuss what should be done. Because the impression that was gotten was that the Russians were saying, either take it out of here, otherwise we cannot guarantee that it's going to be preserved, that it's going to remain there. Halachic authorities were consulted at the time, and they said that in such a situation, if you see bulldozers being brought in to destroy the kever, to destroy that site, then you're permitted to remove it and move it to Eretz Yisrael, move it to a different place. Even though at the time he was buried, there was no stipulation set like that. Whereas if there's a way to preserve it, if there's a way for the kever to remain there, everything possible should be done to see to it that that should be the case. Since there was no stipulation made, there was no condition set at the time of burial, that it was temporary. A person can say when they're burying a parent or a grandparent, lo aleinu, that they're burying them temporarily in a certain place with intentions to move them to a better place when the opportunity comes up. That is permitted under halacha, Hebrew law. But if such a condition is not made, it's not so simple. It's not simple, and it's forbidden to try to move the remains of a person who's been buried. Reb Michal Zichron Avrocha said to the other elders, based on his experience of dealing with the Russians and living in Russia for 60 years of his life, that in a situation like this, it's not a matter of bribing a particular government official. If this is something that's coming from the Kremlin and it's part of a 5-year plan, the only thing that can possibly change such a thing is an appeal to the government on the highest levels. For example, if the United States were to request of the Russian government, let's say, not to harm that location, something like that. Bahashgacha, this was during the Cold War period, when Russia and the United States were not communicating, and just around that time, there was talk of the first summit taking place between the leader of the United States at that time, who was President Jimmy Carter, and the leader of the USSR at the time, who was Leonid Brezhnev. There was talk about a meeting, a summit to take place in Vienna for the first time in tens of years, that the leaders of these two countries were going to try to sit down and talk about strategic arms limitations. And Reb Michal said to the other elders at the time, the only possibility that I could see is if, for example, the leader of the United States would request of Russia at these meetings where they're discussing these things, there's all kinds of other things being spoken about under the table. This one has an uncle in prison over here. This one has a particular interest over here that they need. There's all kinds of things that are swapped. The way he spoke about it, he said, when these leaders get together, there's tables set with the most expensive liqueurs and foods and everything, and there are all kinds of aides that are present at the time that come with their agendas, each one coming with their list of things that they want to try to swap all kinds of different things that could be done when a meeting of this caliber is taking place. So he said, if that's such a meeting, if the United States were to request such a thing, for the Russians, a kever is like a cat, he said. A kever is a cat. The Russians have as much respect for a gravesite, for a religious shrine, as they do for a cat. They could say, you want a kever? We'll give you a dozen. We'll give you we have thousands of graves we can give you. You know, graves we've got lots of. No problem. We have no problem giving that up. And again, depending on the will of Hashem to allow such a thing to take place. So the question was now to try to get in touch with the American government and see if such a thing could be asked. One of the main elders in Yerushalayim at the time was Rabbi Levi Yitzchok Bender. He was older than Reb Michal, and he was respected by most of the Breslevers in Yerushalayim at the time as the elder. He said to Reb Michal, if I were younger, I'd go myself to the United States to see what I could do. But I can't go right now. You're the one who got the message. You have to go. To go and do what you can to see if you could make this happen, if you could prevent the gravesite from being destroyed. Reb Michal said that he was stunned by this because once he came to Eretz Yisrael from Russia, after 60 years of living in Russia, he didn't really have any plans of travel to any other places. And especially doesn't speak a word of English, doesn't have any family or contacts in the United States. So this seemed very far-fetched to him. And he said he decided to do what he usually did when an important issue came up. He decided to go to the Kotel, to the Kotel Maravi, on Shabbos at Mincha time, which is the holiest time of the week, the time when prayers can be most effective. That's the one time in the week when we say, Va'ani sifilosi lecha Hashem eis rotzain, that this is the time when Hashem is most attuned, most willing to listen to our prayers. He said he went there, he walked to the Kotel, about a half hour, 40-minute walk from his home, and he said he drenched the Kotel with his tears, crying, pleading with Hashem, what do you want? What do you want from me? And he said he remembered at the time, when he finished, the thought came into his mind of one of the stories that Rabbi Nachman had told, one of the 13 stories, which deals with a sophisticate and a simpleton, a chacham and a tam. And at one point in the story, the king sends for both of these. He sends a messenger to bring them to him. The sophisticate starts asking all kinds of questions, starts getting involved in all kinds of chakiros and questions, and ends up drawing the conclusion that there's no such thing as a king. There is no king. The simpleton, when he hears that the king is inviting him, he grabs his jacket and he runs. And his wife asks him, where are you going? He says, I can't talk. The king invited. He's out the door. He's running. And Reb Michal said this story came into his mind, and he thought to himself, who knows? If he's being sent, if he's being told go, and there's an opportunity to possibly try to prevent this holy shrine from being destroyed, maybe it's not a time for questions. So sure enough, he accepted this mission, and immediately, right after Shabbos, a letter was sent. In those days there weren't emails, and this is 1979 the way it is today. A letter was faxed possibly or to the United States mentioning this whole affair, because in order to be able to get a passport, he didn't have a passport. To get a passport in 1 or 2 days, a passport and a visa to travel, it needed a request from the United States saying that there was a family crisis and his presence was needed immediately, And on such a letter, he could take to the Israeli government authorities to try to get a passport, a visa as quickly as possible, which is exactly what he did. Gets on a plane on his way to the United States, and before he left, I was living in the United States at the time, in New York, in Brighton Beach, and I received a phone call telling me briefly what this was about, and asking if Reb Michal could stay in my apartment during whatever time he would need to be in the United States to work on this. I didn't know him that well at the time, but to be offered an opportunity to have one of the elders of Breslov stay in your home, I naturally accepted very happily. And they mentioned to me that as far as coming to the airport to meet him, to come alone, nobody else. This was his request. And I heard afterwards that there was some people that had heard about his trip, and they said that maybe there should be a whole delegation from America of Breslevers or religious Jews to meet him at the airport in order to publicize this major crisis and to publicize that he was going to try to work on this project. And when he heard about it, he immediately requested that there shouldn't be any publicity. He said this could only do harm. If the Russians hear that this is something of major importance to the Jewish world, that could possibly make the price tag a lot bigger. So the request was nobody should come, just the person who's going to take me. I remember going to the airport at the time, waiting anxiously to see this Breslov leader come out, and I'm waiting to see him with his suitcases, to be able to grab one of the suitcases or the cart that he'd be wheeling it on, and I see him coming out holding his talis and tefillin. And there's a stewardess walking with him, because again, he doesn't speak English, doesn't know his way, and I ask, where's the luggage? So he says very calmly that they said they lost it, but I don't need it right now really. This was, I believe, a Wednesday. He said, I don't really need anything from there till Shabbos. I have my talis and tefillin, so it'll be okay. Wasn't concerned in any major way, was on a mission. And this was the beginning of a saga that would take place. How he addressed this issue from the time that he landed in the United States. He came with letters at the time. He brought with him letters that had been prepared in Hebrew, in Lashon Kodesh, to the leaders of the Jewish world at that time in New York and the United States, the Satmar Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Zechron Levracha, Rabbi Moshe Shera, the president of Agudas Yisrael, letters informing them briefly of this crisis and asking them to try to help in whatever way they could to avert this catastrophe. We'll hold it here for now. In Yitz Hashem, I hope it'll take maybe another 2 or 3 lectures like this to tell exactly how he went about this and how he succeeded in this mission, Baruch Hashem, at the time. And in that zechus today, this is a site that draws between 50 and 100,000 people throughout the year. On Rosh Hashanah alone, the gathering has grown to 30,000. The numbers, people don't know exactly what the numbers are, but thousands of people, men, women, children, that go there and cry to Hashem for their own personal needs, and crying to Hashem for the Geula, crying for the needs of the Shekhinah, that Hashem should take the entire Jewish people out of the suffering, out of the pain, out of all the crises that all of us are going through. And I believe, seeing how Reb Michal Zechron Levracha handled each step of this, and the response of the different Gedolim, how they responded, what they did, it's an incredible display of Hashgacha Prati, of Hashem's divine intervention in making things happen. And I hope that this will strengthen our emunah in Hashem, emunah tzaddikim, and thereby help to bring about the geula that all of us are waiting for. B'mheira b'yameinu, amen v'amen.